I was born in the 1960s and grew up during the 70s and 80s, and a fairly common sight in living rooms back then, at least in North America, was the console stereo. And in this video, I'm going to show you how I built the modern version. And as you saw in that brief intro, the design is not my own, but it is the one that caught my eye when I was scrolling through examples looking for inspiration. Like the original, I'm going to be building mine from solid wood, mostly rough cut cherry. So I had to do a lot of work to cut, joint, and plane that down to boards that I could use. Now, while you're watching me do some of that, I'll talk a little bit more about my version of this console. It won't have a record player like the original. Instead, it'll have a computer inside with a small amplifier to power the speakers that'll be on the end. And my primary reason for doing this, other than I think this thing looks really cool, is to consolidate all that equipment in one place and reduce the number of cords that are hanging and connecting all over the place. Almost everything is contained inside that center section of the case. This will be my next full tutorial on the Maker's Mod, and if you're serious about learning woodworking, I recommend joining up. In this project, I concentrate on the challenges involved in building something complex like this from solid wood and everything you have to deal with and keep in mind when you do that. So even though you may not want to actually build this cabinet, I think there's enough good information in the course to help with any woodworking project you want to do. So if you are interested, there's a link in the description that'll take you right there. So with most of the material prepped for the build, the next step is to cut out the parts for the speakers on the end. And I'm making the sides, top and bottom for the speaker from the cherry, and I'll be mitering the corners together. And after rough cutting it on the miter saw, I tilted the blade on my table saw to 45 degrees and carefully made those cuts. I'm also making the cuts for the lid of the center section and getting that glued together so that it can dry while I continue working on the speakers. I put the blade back to 90 degrees on the table saw so that I could cut a small reveal and dado in the front edge of each part for the speakers. The dado is for the front panel, which needs to be plywood, and I'm cutting the corresponding tongue on the edge of that. That'll fit into that groove. Originally, I was going to paint the front panels black, and that's the reason why I'm doing this. However, I changed my mind, and I use wood veneer instead. I'm just showing this so that you won't be confused when I put this speaker together. And to put the speakers together, I'm using biscuits, one on each miter, right in the middle. I don't need it on the front because the front panel adds a lot of strength when that's glued in. So I gave the boxes overnight to dry, and then I took it out of the clamps and did some sanding on there just to see how the joints turned out. And everything looks really good, except for the front panel. I've decided that rather than paint it, what I'm going to do instead is use the oak that I'm going to build the stand with, the stained oak, and remove some of that 3/4 inch plywood and replace it with the solid oak. I'm not crazy about having to do this, but I think the results will look a lot better. Pretty much exactly like painting the perimeter of the front panel before putting it in. I've actually stained these panels and put a couple of coats of finish on there before gluing it in. That way I don't have to try to stain that and keep it off the cherry. One thing about doing a big project is that there's always something else you can be doing while you're waiting for the glue to dry on another part. And so what I'm doing right now is I'm getting the stand put together, starting with the pedestal in the middle. And this is just 3 pieces, and the center section is actually another piece of plywood that I've laminated solid oak onto the front. And this gets stained the same color as the front panels on the speakers. I'm wiping it on, rubbing it in, and wiping off the excess. And then I left that to dry overnight, took it apart the next morning, and brought it out and sprayed on 3 coats of clear polyurethane to finish it off. Last thing to put together is the center section, and because this is on the inside and you won't really see it, I'm using the same oak that I used to build the stand with. And it's basically a U-shaped section with the bottom and 2 sides on the ends. And then the back panel is plywood again, and the lid is attached with a pair of concealed hinges. To make it easier to open the lid, I'm cutting a finger groove into the edge. With all of that put together, I could do more sanding. Sanding was a big part of this project, believe me. And then finally, I can see what this cherry looks like with some oil put on. This is a tung oil blend that I'm wiping in and then wiping off the excess. I'll leave this to dry overnight, give it another coat the next day and the day after, and possibly the day after. And I can say at this point, yes, it was the day after, because I'm speaking from the future here. And that will give me a clean, high-quality finish. After I put on the last coat, I gave the oil several days to dry. I wanted to make sure it was absolutely dry before I move on to the next step, which is actually putting the unit together. And by that time, I had the speakers that I ordered. I didn't have them before this. And I could cut the holes in the front of the boxes for them to fit in. After that, there were a couple of days of details that I had to finish up, including putting the 2 ports in the back panels for each speakers, and then rounding those over and putting on foam gasketing tape to make a nice tight seal. And then I could start putting the computer gear inside, starting with the power supply, which I put up in one end. Along with that, I cut another hole in the back for an intake fan that will pull clean, fresh air into the case. And then because I only want one power cord coming out the back, I installed a junction box that everything else is wired into and got the small Class D amplifier put in for the speakers. This amplifier doesn't have a lot of power, but then these speakers are really efficient, so they don't need a lot of power. And here you can see it with the deck put in place, and that's notched to fit around a block that has a USB hub plus the power switch. And I'm going to use this area to keep various things and to plug in any accessories that I need. Anyway, like I said near the beginning of the video, this is going to be my next Maker's Mob full tutorial. There's a link in the description that'll take you there so you can sign up. Doing so will help to support the work I do to put out these free projects.